don't mean to be dramatic, but we are undergoing a biodiversity crisis, and that's what we're here to talk about. It is directly related to the climate crisis, and yet oftentimes is sort of on the sidelines of that conversation. I can't really imagine two better people to speak with about this than Monica Medina, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International and Scientific Affairs, as well as the Special Envoy for Biodiversity and Water Resources, which is a long way of saying that she's at the center of the Biden administration's efforts on these biodiversity issues, and Gerardo Cebellos, who is an ecologist and conservationist at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a leading researcher over the past decades on this topic. We're going to talk about solutions, but Gerardo, I want to start with you just to sort of set the stage. Most people here probably know there's a biodiversity crisis, but can you just give us the context of, how bad is it?
Well, thank you very, very much, Monica. Thank you very much. Well, we all know about the climate change problem, but actually the biodiversity problem is more urgent and is more acute. So it's often called the silent crisis because we hardly see the animals that are becoming extinct and the habitats. And just to give you an idea, the number of species that become extinct in the last 100 years, and we know only 2% of the species that live in this planet, but the vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians that become extinct in the last 100 years would have taken 10,000 years to become extinct under normal times. If the species that are on the brink of extinction become extinct in the next 20, 50 years, the rate of extinction that will have taken 2,500 years to become extinct. That's the magnitude. And the extinction crisis is the only irreversible crisis, environmental crisis, because one species is gone, it is gone. Let me give you very quickly one example. There were 10 million elephants in 1990, in the 1900s. There were only 1.3 million in the 1970s. There are around 300,000 now, and we're losing one elephant every 30 minutes by the illegal trade. There will be no elephants in the wild, probably, in 20, 25 years if this continues. So the problem, the environmental crisis, is huge, it's gigantic, it's unseen, but it's the basis to solve, as we will see in a few minutes, the part of the climate crisis.
Well, thank you for grounding this conversation. Monica, I opened by saying that these issues oftentimes don't receive the attention they deserve, but at the same time, there are many ongoing conversations, which, as I said, you're at the center of. The High Seas Treaty was agreed, I guess, less than a week ago. There's the Convention on Biodiversity discussions that happened last year, the plastics negotiations ongoing. The list could go on and on. But I want to ask you to just give us an overview of the efforts and what do they all add up to?
Thank you, Justin. It's such an honor to be here on this panel with so many other wonderful people helping to close out this incredible convening by the Aspen Institute. It was, we had a big group of people here from the administration, so this is an important conversation. I want to thank the Vice President for coming and Ali Zaidi, the President's Climate Advisor, for coming. This is really an important topic for the Biden administration. We are working very, very hard to bring together all the powers that we have through the government, whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, because we know that we cannot tackle the climate crisis without conserving biodiversity. 30% of what we need to do to solve the climate crisis will have to be done through biodiversity conservation and nature-based solutions. So there you have it. Now, the biodiversity crisis is driven by more than just the climate crisis, but we can help to solve the climate crisis. In fact, we must by working on the biodiversity crisis. So that's, to me, why the agreements that we're working on are so important. So let me mention the three that you talked about. The Convention on Biological Diversity, it's a global agreement. It's been in place for decades. The U.S. isn't even a member of this, but we participated actively in a meeting in December, the most recent conference of the parties, COP, where the world agreed to a global biodiversity framework goal of 30% of the planet conserved by 2030. That's huge. We had never set out that kind of ambitious goal. You know, the 1.5 degree goal for climate is a really ambitious goal. We needed one for biodiversity, and we got it. And most interestingly, China and Canada co-chaired the final meeting where that agreement was achieved. So really big coming together of the world around that. But how do you do that if the ocean isn't part of the deal? Most of the ocean, 50% of the planet, is in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the high seas. And until last weekend, we didn't have a way to protect any of that from all the various different uses that are covered under something called the Law of the Sea Treaty. But last weekend, the world came together again, and we haven't agreed the text formally, but we have agreed, or we haven't agreed the convention or the agreement formally, but we have agreed on the words. The text is frozen, it's being translated now, but within the next couple of months, the world will come together again and agree on how we can actually achieve conservation on the high seas. That's huge. And I'm really pleased that it got so much media attention, Justin. So I hope that the media will continue to write about this important crisis in biodiversity. The last way we're really tackling it now, in a big way, is through plastic pollution. We're drowning in plastic. Amazing statistic. For every person on the planet, there are 21,000 pieces of plastic in the ocean today, and within 6 years, that will double. 6 years, that will double. We are drowning in plastic. And the world, again, came together in the last year, just a year ago, to decide to start another global agreement on protecting from plastic pollution, on ending plastic pollution. And we in the US government are working very hard to drive ambition in that agreement. And hopefully we'll set a really big goal, a big, ambitious, high target. We hope it will be ending plastic pollution by 2040. So it is important for governments to come together and make these agreements and drive change, just like others in the previous segments have talked about. We need indigenous peoples. I was really moved again by the previous presentation by the Nat Geo Explorer talking about indigenous peoples. We must include them in this discussion. They are the best stewards over hundreds of years, and we need their expertise and we need their help because they do have so much biodiversity within their control. The last thing I'll say is finance. Without finance, we won't be able to conserve and protect biodiversity. And that's something that we in the US government are really focused on right now. We are the largest contributor to the Global Environment Facility. We increased our contribution last year when it was re-upped, and now there's almost $2 billion in that facility that will be dedicated to nature finance. But it's hard to put a value and find finance for things that we've taken for granted for decades, thousands of years even. They're free, essentially. We have to change that. We have to change the way we think about nature and biodiversity and value it so that we can ensure that we will continue to protect it.
Well, I want to just ask one very quick follow-up, if you can, because I want to underscore how important this high seas agreement is. How, 2030 is just around the corner, really. How do you get there? How do you protect 30% of the world's high seas by then?
We have to really now explode out of the blocks trying to create these agreements. And the new treaty that we've negotiated requires us to go out and work through the other bodies that already control bits of the ocean. So there's a body that controls deep seabed mining, and there are a bunch of bodies that control regional fishing in the high seas. And we'll have to identify areas, go work through those bodies, but if the parties to this agreement decide that they think an area is deserving of conservation, then every country that agrees to that will have to go and vote in those other places. So we have a mechanism now to kind of bring everyone together around high seas protection, and that's going to get us a long way. We already have 1 big sort of high seas area in the Antarctic. There's an RFMO, a regional fishery management organization in the North Atlantic that's protected an area, and there are lots of areas being identified right now as we speak to start to make the case and draw the lines, literally draw the lines on the map to create protection. We also have to work hard on land. And that's where climate and nature and biodiversity finance and climate finance can all come together to help us conserve the Amazon and the Congo and all the places around the world that will be those natural carbon sinks that we cannot get to the solution without.
Great. So, Gerardo, I want to come to you and just ask, we've been talking about international agreements, and then how does that play out in national governments, but could you just talk a little bit about what all this might look like or mean at a local level?
Well, yes. First of all, I would like to say that in terms of the extinction crisis, the good news is that there is still time. The bad news is that it's rapidly closing. The opportunity is rapidly closing. What's happened in the next 15 or 20 years will define what species are left on the planet. And as Monica says properly, that 30% by 30 is very ambitious. It's not enough. What we have to do is to protect every single ecosystem, and we'll try to restore every single species that is in the planet now. Unless we do something like that at this scale, and basically, very quickly, I was telling a colleague of mine who wrote this paper, we changed the paradigm that the extinction crisis was not normal in 2015 in a paper that became very important in that sense. And basically, when we talk about investment, we need billions, trillions of dollars probably in the next 20, 30 years to do the job. And if we don't do that, it's when but this is probably 1% of the GDP of the planet, and very quickly, if you go to the doctor and say you may have cancer, but it will cost you $1, and you have $10,000 in the bank, you say, no, it's too expensive. That's exactly the same. So at the local level, there are many things working out. I have a small foundation, we're only 3 of us, but in Mexico, we have been working with the local communities. They own a big chunk of land in the border with Guatemala, and we have made agreements. We're protecting now 1 million hectares of forest, and we're going to try to protect 1.5 million hectares. And in one of those deals, 200,000 hectares, around 450,000 acres, is costing us around $2 million a year. That's all. I think if we will invest something like $5 billion in the planet every year for the next year, we will save all the tropical forests and all the forests that are required for human survival.
So I want to follow up on, I alluded in my sort of opening remarks to the connection between climate and biodiversity. Monica, you alluded to this. Gerardo, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Could you just explain to the audience why biodiversity is not just about protecting species, but also about protecting all of us and links to the climate
That's a very
crisis?
Good question. People always say, well, I'm so sorry, the species will have to become extinct if we are going to survive. Let me give you very quick examples. We scientists call ecosystem services all the benefits we get from the nature, the proper work of nature, like the proper combination of the gases of the atmosphere. If this wall is made of bricks, every time we take a brick, the wall starts to work less properly. And sooner or later, if we take one of those bricks, one of the species will collapse. So basically, life on the planet depends on all the plants and animals and the functional ecosystems to have the conditions to have life in general and to have human lives in particular. So every time we lose a species, every time we destroy a forest, we're eroding the capabilities of the planet to maintain life in general and to maintain human life in particular. And I finish with this. We really think there may be a possibility of a collapse of civilization, the way we have been enjoying these great opportunities by living in great places and so on in the next few years, unless we do a massive effort with no similar to what we did in the war in order to stop the problem.
I like that image of ecosystems as a wall of bricks, and we're pulling the bricks away. Monica, I'd like to ask you the same question, but then with one twist, which is just How do you think about trying to bring these conversations into climate conversations where they're missing? How do you bring that message and that knowledge to those conversations?
Well, thinking back to my first COP, if you can believe it, my first climate COP was Glasgow, and I'll never forget Boris Johnson, having led that effort to bring that COP together, said, "It's not just about hugging bunnies." And it's true. I mean, it is. We love bunnies. We love nature and biodiversity, but we love a planet that's healthy and that sustains us. And so it's not hard to bring those conversations together. I've seen over the last 2 COPs an increasing emphasis, climate COPs, an increasing emphasis on biodiversity. I think we have an upcoming UN water conference that will bring together biodiversity and a healthy environment. Water is essential to life. It's also a huge part of the climate crisis, either drought or coastal and inundating floods. So I think increasingly these conversations are coming together. And if you throw in the pandemic, which is another place where the loss of biodiversity has cost us dearly, if we could conserve the places that we need for climate and biodiversity and for zoonotic spillover prevention, oh my gosh, we've solved the world's biggest crises, and we've saved probably a lot of money and so many lives. So to me, the conversations are naturally coming together. People do understand these things are interconnected, but we have to keep talking about nature and biodiversity. It can't all be just about sort of clean technologies and sort of the more market-driven, currently market-driven, but hopefully we'll be changing the way markets work and they'll take biodiversity and nature into account. It can't just be about energy transition.
Right, we need to recognize the importance of biodiversity for those markets to function, right? I mean, that's a hugely important point. Gerardo, do you want to just answer that same question, that, how do you better mainstream the biodiversity conversation? Just to close us off, we have just a few seconds left.
Well, first of all, places like this. I concur that the word is spreading, but you all need to help us to make it louder, to really emphasize. Every time you talk about climate change, please remember that biodiversity relies on you, and we rely on biodiversity.
Can I throw in one last thing? Relying on you, please recycle your plastic badge. Outside, there are bins for it. That's how you can help just today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Some news, some information to use right away. But thank you for this really informative conversation to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.